I spent 4 years not buying a single thing for myself that I didn't absolutely need. No new car when mine hit 140,000 miles. No vacation when my coworkers were posting photos from Cancun and Bali. No new furniture even when my dining room chairs started wobbling so badly that my husband Elliot joked we should wrap them in caution tape before his parents visited. Every bonus check, every overtime hour, every freelance project I took on after my regular shift ended went into a savings account I named simply for them in my banking app. I'm a civil engineer. I've been one for 11 years. People hear that and assume money isn't something I think about carefully, but the truth is I grew up watching my parents count it so precisely that I never learned to waste it. My father, Leonard, spent 32 years as a custodial supervisor at a middle school in southern Ohio. He was the kind of man who could fix anything with what was already in the garage, who drove the same truck for 19 years because it still ran, who coached my softball league for 6 consecutive summers without ever once mentioning that he wasn't getting paid. My mother, Dottie, worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a small dental practice and raised 3 kids in a 3-bedroom house where the rule was simple. If the roof is over your head and there's food on the table, you are not allowed to call yourself unfortunate. They never called themselves unfortunate. Not once. What they also never had was a home that belonged to them. They'd rented the same house in Millsburg for 27 years. The landlord raised the rent every 2 or 3 years, just enough that moving would have been harder than absorbing the increase, and my parents absorbed it every single time rather than uproot my brothers and me from our schools, our friends, our routines. When I graduated high school, that house was still not theirs. When I graduated college, still not theirs. When I walked across a stage to accept my professional engineering license and looked out into the audience to find my father in the 3rd row, with his hands clasped and his eyes red at the corners, they were still renting. My parents' 45th wedding anniversary was coming up in May. I know 45th isn't the milestone that 40 or 50 is. People don't make a fuss about 45 the way they do the round numbers. But I'd been waiting for a reason, and the truth is I didn't need a perfect milestone to justify it. I just needed the account to be ready, and in January of that year, it was. I'd been watching listings for 14 months. Not casually scrolling, actually watching. The way you monitor something that matters. I had alerts set for 3 counties. I knew the difference between what properties looked like in the listing photos versus what they looked like in person after a decade of walking job sites. So when a small craftsman-style house with a covered front porch appeared in Holler Creek, a town 40 minutes from my parents and 15 minutes from Lake Erie, where my father used to take us fishing every summer because the state park launch fee was $4 and the fish didn't care how much money you had. I didn't wait. 3 bedrooms. A workshop space off the garage that was practically built for a man like my father. A kitchen with enough counter space that my mother, who bakes when she's happy and bakes more when she's not, could finally spread out the way she always deserved. A covered front porch with a wooden swing that the previous owners had left behind. Listed at $318,000. I put in an offer the same week. I used my savings, refinanced a small portion against my own home equity, and I closed on it 6 weeks later without telling a single person except my younger brother Charlie, who lived in Portland and helped me coordinate the logistics across the time zones while I handled everything on the ground. The plan took shape over 3 months. My parents believed they were coming to visit me and Elliot for the anniversary weekend. We'd told them we were taking them out to a nice dinner, that we wanted the whole family together for the occasion. My brother Charlie flew in from Portland and stayed with us the night before. My older brother Dennis drove up from Columbus with his wife and their 2 kids. What my parents didn't know was that the dinner reservation was a fiction. That the house in Holler Creek had been cleaned and furnished and stocked with groceries, and that I'd spent 3 evenings that week hanging a gallery wall of photos that spanned every decade of their marriage. Their wedding portrait, a photo from the summer we all went camping in 1994, Christmas morning pictures where my brothers and I were still young enough to lose our minds over bicycles and board games. I'd strung lights across the front porch. I'd put my mother's favorite flowers, yellow tulips, in a vase on the kitchen table. I'd stocked the workshop with a new set of hand tools I'd picked out specifically because I knew exactly which ones my father had been slowly replacing one at a time from the hardware store whenever he could justify the expense. Elliot knew everything. He'd helped me paint the bathroom the previous weekend, and he'd made a grocery run the Thursday before. stocking the refrigerators and pantry so my parents would walk in and feel like it was already lived in. His parents, Raymond and Kathleen, had offered to help with setup, and I'd been grateful for the offer. That's the part I keep turning over when I look back. How grateful I was. I want to say something about my mother-in-law before I go further, because I don't think what happened makes sense without it. Kathleen is a woman who exists in a permanent state of mild grievance. She is not cruel in obvious ways. She doesn't shout or make scenes at family dinners, and she would describe herself, I'm certain, as a devoted and supportive mother-in-law. What she does instead is quieter than that. She makes observations. She notices things. She mentioned once, early in my marriage to Elliot, that I seemed very focused on my career for someone who talked about wanting children. She mentioned another time that my parents' house, the rental in Millsburg, was in a nice enough area, just not the kind of place that held its value. She asked me once, with genuine seeming curiosity, whether civil engineers typically earned enough to justify the cost of my graduate degree. I had absorbed these things for 7 years because Elliot always told me she meant well, and I loved my husband, and I believed, in the way that people believe things they very much want to be true, that what I did with my own money had nothing to do with Kathleen at all. The drive to Holler Creek with my parents took 50 minutes. My mother sat in the passenger seat and asked questions about the area. She'd never spent much time on that side of the lake. My father sat behind me and was mostly quiet, watching the landscape change from highway to two-lane roads to the kind of residential streets where people leave their garage doors open on Saturday mornings. He'd been more tired lately. His knees were giving him trouble. The retirement that was theoretically 3 years away had started to feel, I knew, less like a finish line and more like something he wasn't sure he'd reach with his body intact. I told them I wanted to show them a property I was considering as an investment. A rental, I said. I might need their advice. My mother said that sounded exciting. My father said I should make sure the plumbing was sound. We pulled onto Clover Bend Road at 2 in the afternoon, and the first thing I noticed was that the lights I'd strung across the front porch were gone. I registered this the way you register something wrong before your brain has assembled a full explanation for it. A flicker of wrongness, a second of not understanding what I was seeing. Then I saw that the welcome sign I'd mounted beside the front door, the one I'd ordered personalized with my parents' names, had been taken down. The front porch, which should have had 2 rocking chairs I'd bought from a shop in town and a small table between them with a potted fern, held instead an unfamiliar patio set, wrought iron, cushions and a burgundy I hadn't chosen. My brother Charlie's rental car was parked in the driveway. Dennis's minivan was not, which meant they hadn't arrived yet, and standing at the top of the porch steps, one hand on the railing, was Kathleen. My mother didn't know what this house was. She got out of the car saying something about what a lovely street it was, and she'd made it halfway up the front walk when Kathleen descended the steps with a briskness that I can only describe as proprietary, and pointed at my mother with one extended finger. I'm going to need you to wait there, she said. Not unkindly exactly. The tone she uses when she is being dismissive while maintaining plausible deniability of dismissiveness. We're not ready for guests yet. My mother stopped walking. She looked at Kathleen, she looked at me. The smile she'd been wearing since we turned onto the street stayed on her face for one more second out of sheer social reflex, and then it fell. My father had come around the side of the car and was standing very still. He has a particular stillness, my father. I've seen it only a handful of times in my life. When my grandfather died, when Dennis got into a bad car accident, and we didn't know for 6 hours whether he was going to be all right. It is not the stillness of a man who is calm. It is the stillness of a man working very hard to remain so. I stood by the car door with my keys still in my hand. I could see through the front window that there were things inside the house that didn't belong there. Boxes I hadn't put there. What looked like a folded piece of furniture leaning against the wall of the entryway. A coat rack that was definitely not mine near the door. And there was movement further back in the house. Someone moving through what should have been my parents' kitchen. That's when Elliot came around the corner of the house, from the backyard, carrying the string lights I'd hung 3 days earlier, bundled up in his arms. He stopped when he saw me. He looked at the lights in his own hands. He looked at his mother on the porch, and I watched something shift in his face that I had never quite seen there before. Not exactly surprise, because I think some part of him had known something was off all morning, but the specific shift that happens when the thing you've been telling yourself probably isn't happening reveals itself to definitely be happening. Mom, he said. Just that. We're just getting things arranged, Kathleen said from the porch. Her voice had the texture of someone explaining the obvious to someone being unnecessarily difficult. Your father and I talked about it, and we thought since we'd be spending time here, it made more sense to. To what? Elliot said. Raymond appeared in the doorway behind Kathleen. My father-in-law is a man I have genuinely liked for most of the years I've known him. He is quieter than his wife, more measured, usually the one who changes the subject, when dinner conversation starts edging toward something uncomfortable. He was not changing the subject now. He was standing in the doorway of my parents' house, with the fixed expression of a man who has gone along with something and is now watching it arrive at its natural conclusion. I hadn't said a word yet. I walked up the front path, past my mother. I squeezed her arm as I passed once, just to let her know I was there. And I went up the porch steps and I looked at Kathleen directly. Where is the welcome sign? I said. She blinked. The what? The sign that was mounted next to the front door when I was here Wednesday. Where is it? I didn't think it was. She started, and then seemed to decide that sentence wasn't going to land well, and pivoted. Sweetheart, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Raymond and I were under the impression that this property was going to be a family space, something we could all use. It only made sense to. Under what impression? I said. I didn't tell you this was a family space. I didn't tell you anything about this property, except that I needed help with setup. Elliot mentioned, she began. I mentioned we needed help hanging lights and putting chairs on the porch, Elliot said. He'd come up the steps behind me and was standing slightly to my left. I didn't mention anything else because I didn't know anything else. This isn't my property, Mom. It's my wife's. Kathleen looked at him with the particular expression she reserves for moments when he has disappointed her by failing to take her side. We've been married for 22 years, she said to Raymond, not to Elliot. Everything in a marriage is shared. Their marriage, Elliot said. Mine and Naomi's, not ours. I heard my mother make a small sound behind me. I turned and saw that she had come up onto the bottom step of the porch and was standing there with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, looking at the house, not at the drama unfolding in front of her. At the house itself. At the porch swing. At the yellow tulips visible through the front window. She'd figured it out. I don't know exactly when it happened, sometime between when I squeezed her arm and now. But she had done the math, and she was standing there with her hand on her chest, and tears running down her face in 2 straight lines, and my father had come up behind her and put both hands on her shoulders, and he was looking at me over the top of her head, with an expression I am not sure I have words for. I turned back to Kathleen. I need you to take everything that you brought into this house and put it back in your car, I said. My voice was the voice I use when I'm managing a complicated job site problem, when clarity matters more than warmth. Every box, every piece of furniture, every item that was not here when I left on Wednesday. Naomi, I bought this house with 4 years of my own savings, I said. My name is on the deed. This was a gift for my parents, for their anniversary, and you have spent the last 48 hours rearranging it, without asking me and without telling me. I am not asking you to understand why that's wrong. I am telling you what needs to happen next. Raymond stepped off the porch without a word and went to their car. He opened the trunk and started carrying boxes back out of the house, with the efficient, head-down manner of a man making through action because he has no words that are adequate. I've thought about that a lot since. That Raymond understood immediately and completely what he'd been part of and chose to fix it without negotiating. Kathleen did not move right away. Elliot said, Mom, please. Something in his voice, the please, maybe, or the way he said it, like he was asking her not to make the next few minutes harder than they had to be, seemed to reach her. She went inside. She started gathering things with a stiffness that told me she was angry and believed she was the wronged party. But she moved, and that was what mattered. My brother Charlie had appeared from somewhere inside the house looking mildly stricken, holding a roll of paper towels he'd clearly grabbed for some purpose that no longer applied. He handed them to me without comment and went to help Raymond carry things out. It took 22 minutes. I know because I stood on the porch and watched, and at some point I looked at my phone because I needed something concrete to focus on, and the time was 2:14 when they started, and 2:36 when Raymond closed their trunk. Kathleen paused at the bottom of the porch steps. She was looking at my mother, who was sitting on the porch swing now, my father beside her, his arm around her shoulders. I hope you enjoy it, Kathleen said. I think she meant it to sound gracious. It came out as what it was, a woman who had wanted something and hadn't gotten it, giving up rather than conceding. Nobody answered her. She and Raymond got in their car and left. The silence they took with them was completely different from the silence of the previous 22 minutes. That silence had been dense and uncomfortable, the kind that presses against your eardrums. This silence was the silence of a held breath released, of a porch swing beginning to creak gently, of my father exhaling through his nose in the long, slow way he does when something difficult is over. My mother looked at me. Her eyes were still wet, but her face had settled into something I can only describe as landed, like a bird that has been flying a very long way and has finally found the branch. "This is ours?" she said. "It's yours," I said. "Your names are on the deed. It's been yours since March." She pressed her hand over her mouth. My father looked down at the porch boards, then out at the yard, then at the house behind him like he was cataloging it, making it real. "The workshop," he said. "Off the garage. Come on, I'll show you." I spent the next 3 hours walking my parents through their house. Every room, every detail I'd chosen because I knew them well enough to choose it. My mother stood in the kitchen for a full 4 minutes without speaking, running her hand along the countertop, opening and closing cabinet doors the way you do, when you're checking that something is actually real. My father went to the workshop and didn't come out for 25 minutes, and when he did, his eyes were red, and he cleared his throat twice before he could say anything. Dennis and his family arrived at 4, still unaware of what had happened earlier, and I watched my parents explain it, haltingly, with pauses, my mother wiping her eyes twice, and I watched my sister-in-law tear up, and Dennis go very quiet the way he does when he's emotional but won't show it directly. My niece and nephew ran from room to room, yelling about which of the 3 bedrooms they'd get to stay in when they visited. Charlie put together a playlist of the songs from my parents' wedding reception. Someone, I'm not sure who, had found the cooler I'd packed and retrieved the food from it, and we ended up eating on the back porch as the light started to change, the lake barely visible through the tree line at the edge of the property, just a flat gray glimmer between the branches. My mother sat across the table from me and reached out and held both my hands for a moment without saying anything. There was nothing to say that the gesture didn't already contain. My father stood up after dinner and walked to the edge of the backyard, down to where the property ended and the neighbor's tree line began, and he stood there looking in the direction of the lake with his hands in his pockets. He stayed for a while. I knew better than to interrupt. My father has always processed the things that matter most in the same way, quietly, facing outward, needing a minute to let the fact of something settle into the same category as the other real things in his life. He'd driven 4 hours every summer when we were kids to take us to that lake. 4 hours there, 4 hours back, a cooler packed the night before. Fishing poles that lived in the garage year-round because we used them once a year and never got rid of them. He'd done it without complaint, without making it a sacrifice, without ever suggesting that there might be a closer lake or a cheaper option. He did it because it made us happy, and because making us happy was something he knew how to do with whatever he had. What he had now was a house 15 minutes from that water. I don't know how long he stood there before he turned around and came back to the table. Long enough. When he sat down, he put his hand briefly on my shoulder before he reached for his glass, the way he'd done when I was a kid and had done something he was proud of. Not making a production of it, just placing his hand there for a second so I'd know. 45 years of early mornings and second-shift weekends, and a truck that needed new brakes every 18 months and grocery lists calculated to the dollar. 45 years of a rental where the floors creaked and the landlord raised the rent, and the walls were always just slightly too thin. 45 years of being the kind of people who made everything work and never once asked anyone to notice. I noticed. I had always noticed. Elliot called his mother that night. I wasn't in the room, but I heard enough to know that the conversation was not brief and was not comfortable. What he told her, when he came and found me afterward, was that he had said what needed to be said, that the house was mine, that what they had done was not a misunderstanding but a decision they had made quietly over several days, and that it had hurt people who had never done anything to deserve it. On a day that was supposed to be about them. He said his mother had cried. He said he was sorry that she had cried, and also that he would not be walking it back. I told him I loved him. He said he knew. Then he said he also thought the workshop was probably the greatest gift anyone had ever given a man with a lifetime of unfinished projects, and that my father was going to spend 90% of every future visit in that garage. And I laughed, and it was the real kind of laugh. The kind that comes from relief settling into something lighter. Kathleen called me 2 weeks later. She said she had reflected and believed the situation had been handled poorly on her end. She said she hadn't fully understood the significance of what the house represented. She said she hoped we could move forward. I said I appreciated her calling. I meant it partially. What I understood by then was that Kathleen hadn't moved into my parents' house because she was malicious. She'd done it because somewhere along the 7 years of my marriage, she had developed a quiet, unexamined belief that the things I built were available to her family by extension. That my earnings were adjacent to Elliot's, which were adjacent to the family, which meant they were, in some loose and unchallenged logic, available. She had never examined this belief because no one had ever held it up to the light and made her look at it directly. I had held it up to the light. Now she was looking at it. What I know about my parents' house now, 18 months later, is this. My mother bakes on Sunday mornings and leaves a plate covered in foil on the kitchen counter because the habit of making enough for other people hasn't left her, and she suspects it never will. My father has repaired and refinished every piece of furniture in the house that needed it, has reorganized the workshop 3 times, and has started fishing at the lake on Thursday mornings, which he tells me when I ask is fine. Just fine, nothing remarkable, just a thing he does now on Thursdays. My mother sent me a photo last October of the front porch. In the early evening, the swing visible, the last of the summer light catching the tulips she'd replanted in the window box I'd installed before they moved in. She didn't add a caption, she didn't need to. Some things you spend your whole life building toward without knowing. That's what you're doing. My parents built toward me and my brothers. I built toward them. That's how it's supposed to work, I think. Not a transaction, not a debt repaid, but a long, quiet reciprocity between people who love each other more than they'll ever fully say out loud. The porch swing creaks the same way ours did when I was 7. I noticed that the first time I visited after they moved in, and I didn't say anything about it either. Some things you just let be what they are.